Chicas, yo soy el señor Dutton o Dutton, como sea, y yo doy las clases de Español 4 a Pre-AP, Español 4, BI o IB, y también las clases de Español 5 AP. Estoy haciendo este pequeño video para explicarles un poco de qué hacemos en Español 4, qué hacemos en Español 5, para que tengan toda la información necesaria para hacer sus decisiones. Yo sé que ahorita ustedes están pensando, están considerando, decidiéndose si debo ir a la clase de Español 4 Pre-AP o la clase de Español 4 BI, o si puedo ir directamente a la clase de AP, etc. Entonces, en este video yo voy a dar mi consejo y también los consejos de unos estudiantes. Alright, the rest of it will be pretty much in English, but just wanted to throw you out some Espanol just right out of the gate, because it'll start pretty much like that in any of those classes, Spanish for Pre-AP, IB, or AP, and that's a great thing. You need to be thrown Spanish all the time. You need to be thrown into things. You're on a path trying to get to fluency. And I'll start by saying this. One thing that I say often is many people, many intelligent, wise people, have agreed that the very best way for you to learn another language is to go there and immerse yourself in that culture. And then I try to paint the picture of, well, imagine yourself in that culture the first day, the first week, the first month, the first year even. How well, especially starting out, are you going to understand what people are saying? Probably not very well. You'll probably have moments being lost, maybe even stressed out. But again, we had already established that's what the best way to learn another language. So hopefully we're all willing to kind of go through a little bit of pressure, a little bit of stress, but a lot of fun also for any of those classes. So what I'm going to do next is basically give you some of those little consejos, the little advice cards. I'm going to just kind of read some of them to you. I'll show a few to you so you know I'm not lying to you and making it up. Since you don't know me yet, you don't know that I would never lie to you. But I'll show you a couple of cards and tell you basically what all these cards say. And these are from students that are in Spanish for IB and Spanish for Pre-AP both. And then after I go through some of those, I'll try to give you maybe some specifics on differences between those two classes for those of you who are trying to make that decision which Spanish 4 you should be in. And I'll talk more about AP kind of toward the end of the video, or I might even make that a separate video, so just stay tuned because who knows. Alright, so I'm going to kind of pick a couple things that students wrote a lot about. Okay, so one of them is basically, see if you can see this. There are a lot of vocab words. Make lots of flashcards. You don't necessarily have to make flashcards, but that was their advice. I do put everything on Quizlet, and I also put everything on another quiz-based online system called BrainRush. Some parts of the year you'll actually be required to go in and complete those. Other times of the year it's just up to you if you have the time and you want to do that. But there are a lot of them that are basically related to vocab or just studying in general. You can see this person said, estudiar mucho, don't procrastinate. Practicar mucho, see if you can see that. And keep your past notes. Don't just forget everything over the summer. You know, if you're seeing this in the spring, you've got months ahead of you before you get to Spanish 4. So not only would you be wise to not let it get just rusty over the summer, but you would also be very wise to even get ahead and even practice and get better at and learn some things that you don't know right now, finishing up Spanish 3. This person also basically said, yes, they basically said to keep some things from Spanish 3, some notes on the grammar and stuff like that. This person said remember grammar over the summer, so maybe those of you that are familiar with the website Conjuguemos, www.conjuguemos.com, right? If you're not familiar with it, you will be when you're in my classes because it's one of the very often go-to resources that I'll throw at you. And sometimes we'll have lab days, and that's one of the sites that we use on the lab days as well. Let's see. Review old conjugations. This person said especially imperfect versus preterite. And I'll kind of jump around a little bit. Somebody had said they weren't sure when they were in your shoes, when they were in Spanish 3, they weren't sure how much of the same grammar would show up. Basically from Spanish 3, all that grammar comes back again, but you just have to produce a little bit more Spanish with it. Sometimes you go into deeper or other usages for it. You do dive into themes, thematic vocabulary, more so than you would on a Spanish 1, 2, or 3. But in terms of the grammar that you're seeing again, for instance, the future tense can be used exactly how you would say I will do, but it also has a usage of conjecture, where you're basically saying, I wonder if something is the case. I bet something is the case, or it must be happening right now. Something like that. There's a couple different ways that you can say that, but one of the ways to do that is actually to use the future tense. Context would tell you, that you're not actually trying to say somebody will, but that you're wondering, I wonder if it is the case. So that would just be an example of sometimes you go back over something that you already knew, but you might not have realized that there was that alternate usage for it as well. Study the conjugaciones, study your conjugations. Somebody says make verb charts, which sometimes that'll be like a homework, but you can make verb charts on your own. Conjuguemos is really good for just getting a lot of quick practice in for the conjugations. Study vocabulary, don't get behind. Make sure you know your verb tenses and when to use them, so the usages of them, not just the verb tenses. I was going to tell you, since you're kind of recycling a lot of the Spanish 3 grammar, but just going deeper with it and using it more and producing more, so you're writing longer, you're speaking longer, that kind of stuff. You do go back through all those same tenses, and then you add one more, only one new tense in a whole year of Spanish 4. And that's the imperfect subjunctive, which I'm sure you've actually seen and heard here or there, but you just probably never learned it as an official requirement of any chapter in Spanish 1, 2, or 3. And so you'll probably pick that one up around January, February of your spring semester. Otherwise, you basically go very similarly as you did through the Spanish 3 grammar. You start the year by reviewing present tense, including all the weird ones like the ZCOs and the ones that go from a G to a J, like escoger goes from G to J, escojo, etc. So, and then you go into the preterite versus imperfect, which is probably one of the harder ones just for years. It's just a harder skill, it's a harder tense to master, those two past tenses. And so you work on that. You go back through present subjunctive, and you do future conditional. You eventually touch again on the present perfect subjunctive. But right around when you go through the future and conditional is when I put in the imperfect subjunctive, because it kind of works really well with the conditional. Don't have to worry about that right this second, but just so you know. Somebody said when they were in Spanish 3, they were wondering, is Spanish 4 going to be easier than Spanish 3? No, it's not. I'm not sure why we would ever really expect a level 4 to be easier than a Spanish 3, but in a sense, I mean, you're better at it. You're a better speaker and a better writer and a better listener, and everything else that you do with the Spanish language. But yes, just as your ability goes up, also the expectations go up. So it's definitely not easier, but I think that if you tried hard and you had some good study habits and you really picked up a lot of the vocab and did your best to master the grammar in Spanish 3, then Spanish 4 isn't that much of a jump, really. It's just more time and more of an investment. You do start to see a little bit more of a noticeable difference between people in terms of just their comfortability in the, I don't know if that's a word, but in the language and things like that, because if you think about it, it's cumulative. You go through 4 years of Spanish, and if you've got some people that from day one, they're putting in extra study time, they're being as prepared as possible, they're trying to use it outside of class as much as possible. In Spanish 1, you and somebody who didn't do those things might not have a terribly different grade. It might be, within 10 points or something. But then each year you kind of see a difference, a bigger divide, if you will, between the students who are going to put in the time, put in the effort, like all these students are saying, practice your conjugations, practice your vocabulary, and all that, so that by the time you get 4 years into it, I mean, it should be pretty clear that you're going to have a big gap between some people that are still wanting to go on, but they're just not really giving 100% with it. And of course, I'll do everything I can to meet everybody's needs, and we're all improving. And one thing that's important to remember is you're not in competition with your neighbor. You're not in competition with anybody else in the class. You are working on your own self. You're working on your own skills. And every day you can get better, and every day you should get better. But it just is a matter of time. But talking a lot about the work on the front end of it, because I don't want you to be deceived that it's just you show up and we just hablar en español todo el día. But it's definitely super fun and mega awesome. But just trying to give you some specifics here. Another thing to consider, as I was saying, some students have just had maybe a different experience in terms of how much effort, how much time they chose to put into Spanish 2, Spanish 3, and that's going to affect how much Spanish 4 feels like a jump or not to them. For instance, I've got a couple of cards here. One says, this one says, there is a lot more homework. There's a lot more homework. And personally, I mean, I think that just depends on the teacher and where you went to school, and you got all kinds of people coming from different teachers. I mean, I've taught Spanish 3 before, and I don't really assign much more homework, if any at all, in Spanish 4 than I did in Spanish 3. It's about the same, I think. And this person says they didn't know the difficulty level of the transition, so maybe that's something you're thinking about. How much more difficult is it going to be? And then I've got other people also from, looks like the same class, that say things like this: it's probably not as bad as you think it is. For me, it's not. What's something somebody else said? This person said, this is kind of more just about being willing to put yourself out there and be a little bit brave. That's kind of hard for you to read, but says, don't be afraid to push yourself. Taking risks and making mistakes is the best way to learn. True. So yeah, that's a little bit of just kind of showing you how different people have different reactions or expectations based on what they say. This person says, get comfortable speaking in Spanish to people. And then somebody else, because speaking is always one of the things that people are curious about, the actual speaking of the language. I don't know if I can make that visible there. Anything above Spanish 3 is lots of speaking, so try to immerse yourself in Spanish over the summer. Prepare yourself. Whereas this person said, is there a lot of speaking? Not very much in the first semester, but more in the second semester. And they're taking the same class, so again, it kind of has to do with what your Spanish 3 experience was like. Did you guys speak a lot in the class, or was it just kind of every once in a while when they were like, okay, now we're doing a speaking activity, or now you're taking a speaking test, or was there lots of speaking thrown in? Just depends on what your experience was, really. This person says that they heard rumors that IB is more speaking focused compared to AP. So some people are making that choice this year between pre-AP4 and IB4. Some people are making the choice between maybe IB4 and AP5 if they're a senior and they're trying to get AP in before they're out of here. So I'll talk a little bit more about AP in a minute, but I would say that since I teach both classes, I'm a very speaking focused teacher. If you can't figure that out already, for me it's kind of pointless for you to be able to read a language well and not be able to communicate with people very well. And unfortunately there are a lot of people that are like that. I personally went to college with a handful of people at least who went through all the courses, got a Spanish major, and they got out of 4 years of college after however many years of high school, and they could still barely conduct a conversation fully in Spanish. And it was just because they would do the work, they would read, they would study the words, but they didn't ever try to use it outside of class. They didn't try to immerse themselves in speaking. They didn't go and find people that they could talk with and things like that. So that's just a necessary requirement. I mean, obviously we all want to be fluent, and you're just not going to be a fluent speaker from studying words and reading. I mean, you've got to speak. You've got to. And speaking of speaking, someone said, I didn't know about the essays or that there wouldn't be speaking sections on the test. So let me kind of make a little note of this. I'll talk about essays in a second when I give kind of some more specifics between pre-AP4 and IB. As far as speaking not being on the test, that's different for you from Spanish 3. Spanish 1, 2, and 3, you know, you basically have tests that are point-wise and generally speaking time-wise equal in how much they expect you to read, write, listen, speak. In Spanish 4, it's just kind of the way the tests are set up. Usually we have, in a given unit, which will take 3 weeks to a month, depending on the unit, at some point in the second week, we'll have quiz number 1, and at some point in the third week, we'll have quiz number 2, and then at some point in the fourth week, usually, or maybe at the very end of the third week, we'll have a unit test. So it's always quiz, quiz, test, quiz, quiz, test, quiz, quiz, test. And of course that's subject to change, just like anything else. I'm making this video this year, but every year I'm, you know, reevaluating, monitoring, adjusting, as you probably have heard from teachers. Just always trying to make it as good as it can be, the best possible experience for you. And so I'm always kind of modifying the quizzes and the tests and things like that. So to that end, generally speaking, subject to change, the first quiz is kind of more association, matching. There's a little bit of vocab, there's a little bit of whatever the grammar is, but not necessarily all of the grammar for the whole unit. And it's generally set up in matching, multiple choice, fill in the blank, conversation, conjugation, stuff like that. I am getting a little bit away from just fill in the blank conjugations, just because it's not really a really useful life skill. You're never going to have a job where someone's like, I've got this paragraph, but I'm just missing my verbs. Can you help me out? That just doesn't happen, really. It happens in school a lot, but never really in real life outside of that. So there's still a little bit of that, but more and more getting more towards like whole ideas where almost everything you're doing is in sentences at least or something like that. You know, there's still a little bit. So point being, that first quiz is a little bit easier. It's just kind of recognition and matching and short production. The second quiz, which is about a week later usually, has a production side of the vocab where it has a bunch of the vocab, usually about 25 words, and that's all written in English, and you literally just have to write it out in Spanish. So you get no help, no word bank, anything. The idea there being, at that point you've had the vocab for 2.5, 3 weeks, and you should basically be a rock star at that vocab. You know, you've done whatever minimal things we're going to do on it inside the class, then you've gone and you've done Quizlet, Brain Rush, flashcards, whatever it is that you want to do. And you know, you're just awesome at that vocab. I'll give you specifics next year on exactly how to get ready for all these different quizzes, but I'm just trying to give you the facts right now. I know this is already going to be a long video, but anyways, on the other side of that second quiz is one of the big productions. So a lot of the fall, and this might change a little bit next year, but a lot of the fall what I have is just a long writing. So you have kind of a scenario prompt that that requires you to write basically a short essay, but you know, 1 page of text. So you might be used to, like Spanish 1 and 2, you had like 1 or 2 paragraphs that you would write on those writings. Spanish 3, it was a little bit bigger, maybe a half page. And then Spanish 4, you know, you've got a whole page to do those longer writings. You know, we'll do different practices and things like that to get ready, but you're just writing more, so that's one of the things that you do. But I rotate it, so sometimes the front of that second quiz is always vocab production, English to Spanish. The second half of that quiz rotates between a long writing or a long speaking. So you'll have a similar prompt on the speaking, but then you'll use the famous grabadoras that you're used to using in your Spanish 1, 2, and 3 to do the speaking. And so it just rotates, sometimes speaking, sometimes writing. So there are speaking assessments that are unassisted. but they're not on the unit test. They're fit into the quizzes. And then on the unit test, you've got listening portion, which is generally one of the harder sections for most students going to Spanish 4. And so that's why I second the recommendations of some of these students who said just try to immerse yourself as much as possible and watch and listen to as much authentic at normal speed Spanish as possible to get your ear used to it, because you'll have these conversations that are different, very different people, different accents, different places, sometimes easy to hear, sometimes not easy to hear, but inevitably that always seems to be one of the sections that people really feel like, wow, that's very different than the Spanish 3 listening or something like that. For instance, with some of the lower level listenings, they might mention a certain word or certain phrase that for you kind of tips you off. So you're thinking, oh, I heard them say that word, so I'm going to put that one word, or I heard them say that one word, so I'm going to circle this answer. Whereas you didn't necessarily really hear much or be able to listen and make out and understand a lot of it, but you're just kind of like grabbing for clue words. So the level 4 and then level 5 as well kind of require you to go beyond that, where you're not just hearing a word here or there, but you're really working to listen and understand almost all of it, so that if you see a wrong answer somewhere, but it's a word that you heard, you're not tricked by that, but you actually heard the real thing. So that kind of stuff. This is going really long. Lo siento mucho. This person says, I wish I had known how to speak better in Spanish. There is way more vocabulary in Spanish 4. Make sure you study the Quizlet. So that's true. Like I said, we take about a month per unit, but a week and a half, 2 weeks into it, you're starting that very first quiz. So you really have to jump onto that vocab. Each vocab list is about 100 to 150 words, so it's a lot more words than what you had in Spanish 1, 2, and 3. But it's totally doable. Sometimes some of that vocab is recycled from earlier years or earlier units. And we generally focus in on some of them, some really of the more important words, because sometimes there's some just random words that are on the list and we don't really know why someone somewhere thought that was really important for us to practice that word, but that happens. This person says, IB Spanish 4 isn't as hard as I thought it would be. If you're confident in Spanish 3, you'll do fine. It's also less grammar-based and more real-world. So that's their take on it. Like I said, we do go back over all the grammar, and we do take in a lot of new vocab. The class is thematic, so basically it aligns to every chapter. There's a big theme, an overarching theme, like global issues or science and technology or the environment, or one of these things where ultimately your end goal is I want to be able to write and or speak confidently and accurately about this issue, and not just know trivia, so to speak, in terms of be able to match a vocab word or put in a correct conjugation. But no, you want to be able to communicate. That's your end goal. And let's see. Is Spanish 4 pre-AP hard? They say there is a lot of homework and grammar involved, but you get a lot of help. There is a lot of stuff like new vocab and conjugations that you learn in Spanish 4 compared to when you were in Spanish 3. Okay. What are the differences in those classes? We'll talk about that in a second. Okay, and the other thing that I got several cards on was Español en acción, right? Español en acción. So what does that mean in English? I'm not going to say it because you know what it means. All right, so this person says IB has a lot of work. So remember that other person said IB isn't that much work. So again, it's kind of personal perception on how much effort you put into your previous class to make it seem like more of a jump or less than a jump, but definitely requires work and time. Just mentions Español en acción. This person recommends Duolingo. If you're not familiar with that, it's a good little vocab building app. Be ready for outside work. learning vocab during your hours per month, and I'll explain it in just a second. But Español en acción, Español en acción. Okay, so Español en acción, I will explain it a lot better when you're actually in the class, because this video is already like 25 minutes long, so I don't even know if you're going to be watching it this long, but I'm going to keep talking and assume that you are, because I'm super interesting, right? All right, so Español en acción is basically a log. It's a log that you keep, a record that you keep month by month. And what you're doing there is you're tracking your extra practice time and your extra Spanish immersion time that you're doing. And the goal of that extra time is not just to get class credit, although it is, a grade in the grade book. But the real goal there is to build your fluency as a speaker and a writer, a listener of the language, right? So you've got those categories: reading, writing, listening, speaking, the same ones that you've been, hitting on for 4 years. And I'll get into the details with you next year about it, but there's certain things that you're allowed to put on it, certain things that you're not allowed to put on it, or there are limits on how much, like for instance, how much music you can count, or how much movie time you can count, stuff like that. But you've got to practice all 4 skills. And this is above and beyond your nightly homework. Like if we have a worksheet to do or something like that, that would not count towards this time. This would be time on top of that you fit in here and there as you have time. Pre-AP 4 does less. So if you're like super busy and getting the weighted credit or being in the IB class isn't crucial to you, you might consider doing the Pre-AP 4 class just because you're doing fewer hours per month. Pre-AP 4, and of course all this is subject to change, but Pre-AP 4 this year, they're doing 6 hours per month of Español en Acción, and IB and AP, they both do 12 hours per month of Español en Acción. So like I said, that's time each month that you're spending above and beyond any sort of like studying for a test, or I do let you count that a little bit, but I'll give you some specifics on how much that can count for and stuff. But this would be examples like reading news online in a Spanish newspaper, Spanish publication, blog, etc. This would be watching movies in Spanish, watching movies with Spanish subtitles, listening to music, watching newscasts, watching shows in Spanish, watching TED Talks in Español. ¿Qué más? On speaking, obviously at speaking, so you're coming and working with me, or you're working with a family member, or a friend, or coworker, somebody that has a noticeably higher fluency than you, or a more academic vocabulary than you, perhaps, depending on who you're talking to. And then writing, obviously, is writing practice. So some people do like a little diario, like a little journal, and then they just kind of keep that and show it to me, or they might do little letters, or just kind of some random little self-imposed essays or something, and then they'll turn that in with it. But like I said, it's for the goal of getting you where you need to be fluency-wise, and especially for IB, you really want to spend as much time as possible, even above and beyond that time if possible. And like I said, I'll explain that more next year on like what you do exactly and how much time each thing can count for. But I give you a gazillion resources, and I'm putting Google Docs up there like there's no tomorrow, and I try to give as much of my time as I can, during seminar, before school, after school, during 7th and 8th hour if I have those open during the year, next year, that kind of stuff. This person says, eventually you will need to take Spanish in college. So continuing is very important. Also, Spanish gets easier the more you practice, so keep practicing. All right, that's from an IB student. Okay, so let's see. It is 28 minutes in, so I'm going for a record here. I'm going to talk a little bit about the differences between Pre-AP 4 and IB 4. And so that person mentioned essays. So I would imagine that in your Spanish 3 class you had some form of an essay at some point. You've got those writing portions of the test, so probably at least getting ready for those, sometimes you would do a writing practice, either in class or as a homework. And so, generally in Spanish 3, when I had Spanish 3 classes, I would often have my students write something that was half a page, a whole page, more than a page, depending on if it was an in-class thing or a homework thing. And so it, again, kind of has to do with what kinds of things you were doing in Spanish 3. As far as IB is concerned, because we still do writings like that in Spanish 4 in pre-AP, but in IB you have some additional components, some additional requirements, and most of them come out actually in the spring semester. So in the fall semester, the two classes are pretty close together, actually. There's a few extra things here and there. Certain things are graded more critically in IB, and a little bit not as harshly graded, I guess you could say, in pre-AP 4. But there is one thing for sure that we start for IB, and short version so that you understand this. IB, kind of comparing it to AP, they're both weighted classes, they're both a weighted grade, they're both getting you ready for college Spanish and for higher fluency in the language. And AP, you study and you practice and you do all these things all year long, and then you have this one day where you've got this 1 3-hour test, and it's not connected to your class grade, but that's where you get that takeaway, that AP score that's going to travel with you and maybe get you to clip out of things or give you some college credit, at least be something you can put on a college application, a resume, things like that. Whereas IB is kind of similar to that. There are actually 5 main components. So you do practice and study and do things all year long, but there's one component called a trabajo escrito, or the written task, and it's basically an essay. So it can take a lot of different forms. Again, we'll get into the details next year, but it does involve outside class time. There are some things that we'll do during the year in terms of projects and some of this extra stuff for IB where I will give the students permission to say, okay, now you can count this towards your Español en Acción, so that it's not just too overwhelming of a time commitment. But a lot of things that are just like little homeworks and things like that, they don't count towards the Español en Acción. And then, so we have that one that's, like I said, kind of like an essay. And we do it once or twice, depends on how much time there is. This year we're doing it twice. And so the process generally takes people a couple of weeks to a month, maybe at the most. And ultimately we send that essay in to IB headquarters to be graded and assessed. So that's one. Then we also have the 2 speaking components. Basically you've got interactive orals, and that's basically where you have some different group activities. You might watch something or read something. We might present something in class, and then in small groups you discuss it todo en español, and we record it with the little grabadoras, and then we evaluate a few of those exercises that you do in small groups, speaking just with each other interactively. And then you have the entrevista, so the big interview is your 3rd component, and that is the main reason why we try to really ramp up the speaking, especially in the 2nd semester, like someone mentioned, because when you're taking Spanish 1, 2, and 3, you do speak a little bit more each time. But even in Spanish 3, people might be speaking for a couple of minutes on their speaking test, and when you're doing this interview, you go into a room, you see a couple of pictures, you get to make a choice on which thing you want to talk about, and just from whatever's in your cerebro, whatever you've studied, read, heard, talked about, learned about up until that point, that's what you have access to right there. You don't get to go look up anything after you find out what you're talking about. You sit there and you think through it, you plan it out for about 15 minutes, and then you have a 10-minute interview. And the first 6 minutes is just presentacional. You're just presenting it to me, and it's not interactive, so it's just you talking for 6 minutes. And it's not like a lot of the Spanish 1, 2, and even 3 things for your test are really situational. So it's like, you got a flat tire, or you have a doctor's appointment, or you need to buy something, or something like that. How do you resolve this little conflict or this situation? Whereas the interview is going to be based on one of those big themes. So you're going to talk about el medio ambiente, you know, the environment, or you're going to talk about immigration issues. You're going to talk about science and technology, how that connects to, you know, environment. If you're going to talk about energías renovables, things like that. So these are not just situational things; they're bigger ideas, themes that you would support with those things that you read, heard about, saw todo el año. And then, if any of you watch this whole entire really long video, I will give you a cookie. Okay. And then, so we've got the, and then the other part of the 10 minutes, so about 4 minutes, is a back and forth interview. But it's still basically close to 10 minutes of you talking and talking about something that's a little bit heavier, and you can't just overgeneralize like, pollution is really bad, it's bad. So you can't just do something like that. You've got to really know your stuff. But, you know, I work with people all year long on this. We do mini practices. We do a mock interview. We do the real interview. We take whichever one is best for you, and we send that to IB. So, like I said, for those main components, we've got the trabajo escrito, which could be kind of like an essay, basically. The interactive orals, where you're doing small group speaking interactively. The entrevista with me, which we record and send that off to be moderated as well, which means they can adjust the grade that's on that. And then the last two are kind of together. It's 2 different days, 2 tests. So you've got those 5 things. I'll say them again, trabajo escrito, the oral interviews, or the oral interactives, the oral interview, and then the last 2 are tests, but they're called papers, but they're really tests. So paper 1, paper 2, but it's actually tests. So all of those 5 things get smashed together magically, and they form your IB score. Whereas AP, your AP score just comes from that one day, that 1 3-hour test that you take. The IB score is a composite of all those things together. So I'll explain it more next year, but I'm already probably going to break YouTube by trying to upload this really long video, so I'm trying to wrap this up here pretty much. ¿Qué más? Me gusta el café. ¿Qué más? There was something else I was going to tell you. All right. Well, I'm going to... Well, anyway, there's a lot I could say, but a mí me encanta la clase de español 4, pre-AP o BI, como sea. También las clases de AP. Espero verles el año que viene. We always have a lot of fun. Siempre nos divertimos mucho. We do have lots of extra little things that we'll do in there. You know, we still have food days. We still have we have project days that are kind of on top of that. We're about to do a project where mañana people are bringing in food from a country that they studied and did a little project on and stuff. So there's lots of effort, yes, but there's lots of great payoff from it. And so I just love the classes, and I feel like most people really enjoy them as well, even though there's a lot of effort involved. So I'm going to sign off on this before I hit 40 minutes. Hopefully you guys will watch this, and I'm going to make a separate video that is kind of more of explaining AP or comparing IB and AP for those of you making that decision. All right. Ciao. Nos vemos.